Hello, you're listening to Under the Skin with me, I don't even know my own name. You're listening to me, Russell Brand, and I'm talking to Professor David, I'm assuming Professor.
Yeah, you can drop the professor. I don't like it very much.
Oh, Professor, eh? I've come up in the world. Professor David Harvey, I'll be talking to as if we was equals. David Harvey, Professor David Harvey, is the world's leading Marxist thinker.
Oh, no.
That's what it says. So I'm just reading the script, mate. I'm just reading the script. He writes extensively on Marxist geography, social justice and the political economy, and is the author of over 20 books, including 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, Rebel Cities, and The New Imperialism. He is a distinguished professor of anthropology and geography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and has been teaching Marx's Capital for almost 40 years. His new book is titled Marx, Capital and the Madness of Economic Reason. Professor David Harvey, thank you very much for being our guest on Under the Skin.
Thank you.
You're here somewhat to promote this book, Marx, Capital and the Madness of Economic Reason. Why have you written this book now?
Well, I've been involved over several years now in what I call the Marx Project, which is to try to explain to people what it was that Marx was talking about and to do it in terms which are simple without being simplistic. It's been quite a challenge to do that because Marx is kind of bit of a hard read when you first read him. But a lot of academics spend a lot of their time trying to make Marx more complicated than he already is. So I'm trying to make it simpler so that people can grasp it. And I've had a series of books which have come out, and this is the last one, and it may not be the final one, but I try to put a lot of things together in this book about what's going on in the 3 volumes of Capital, how the 3 volumes relate to each other, and how coming out of that you get a picture of capitalist society and the essence of what capital is about. So that's what I'm trying to do in the book, and I'm hoping that people will pick it up and read it and give a good shot at understanding it.
Given your stated objective of making capital more accessible, perhaps we'll start this conversation with perhaps illuminating a few simple terms and ideas. So I'll go through these questions because this is an important topic, and we've looped into this because our preemptive chat I was really getting off on, but I would like to make sure that we build sufficient foundations. Yeah. Firstly, why are you not calling it Das Kapital like how you're supposed to?
Well, I'm using the English translation, so I use the English language to talk about it.
Not talking
there are some problems about the translation, and obviously, but that's what I'm working from.
Because I suppose because of that brief to simplify.
Right.
So, firstly, why is this book so important? I mean, Capital, although your book I think is important as well. I'm not trying to belittle your book. So why is Capital and why is it an important book? What's in there that's relevant to people today in 2017 after we have endured the negative stories about communism? Why is this book? Why is Capital an important thing for us to understand now?
First off, Capital as a book is not about communism.
Oh,
it's a critique of capitalism. And it's not even a critique of capitalism in every respect. It's a critique of how what I would call the engine of capitalist development works, how the laws of accumulation of capital work, because capital is an expansionary system. It's constantly expanding, and how does it expand, and what kind of stresses does that create amongst working people? What kind of stresses in relationship to cultural evolution? What kind of stresses in relationship to environmental questions and the like? And we're surrounded, obviously, with all of those questions about the environment, about cultural preservation, about even the definition of what it means to be a human being. We're having a big debate about that in the United States right now because everybody looks looks at Trump and says, is that the future of what humanity is going to look like? And the answer of many people is no, we've got to think of something really different. So with all of those questions around, you need to know what it is that is driving capitalism to do the kinds of things it does in relationship to exploitation of the environment, social inequality, cultural transformations, the production of new wants, needs and desires, all of those sorts of things. We need to have a theory of that. And Marx is the first person really to come to terms with what that theory might look like.
In the 1850s, Marx was able to identify in this critique of capitalism what likely trends and what the result of capitalism would be, even though this is 150 years ago, and that's one of the reasons you've written the book, isn't it? Even though 150 years ago, he was able to predict. What was it about capitalism then that made it evident that this economic system would fail?
Well, first that it has to grow.
Right.
It has to grow at what we call a compound rate, which is kind of 3% per year. Is a small amount of new commodities and so on back in 1850, but by the time you get to 2000, it's a huge amount of new commodities. So it's got to grow, and at some point or other, it's going to hit limits to that growth.
So in the end, that's quite a simple observation that Marx made then, because if you change the word capitalism to the word elephant, then he's like going, hold on a minute, if this elephant has to continue to grow, it's going to fill the room and kill us all.
Yes,
like you just pointed out that.
Right, yeah, no, it's a growth machine, and it has to grow because that's the only way in which it can assure profitability. Profit is an excess.
Yes. And
you have to produce the excess in order for capital to survive, and then you have to use that excess to produce more excess. So it's endless accumulation is one of the rules of the game.
Necessarily and essentially impractical. It's not about fulfilling a practical need. It's about creating needs that are not there in order that it might continue to have compound growth. So how come that observation was made in 1850? How come everyone didn't go, oh yeah, that's a good point, right, stop this capitalism then?
Well, because there was plenty of room to expand back in 1850. Right. I mean, the rest of the world was there, and of course we had colonialism, we had imperialism, we had all of the expansions around the world. So there's plenty of room for that growth to occur. It was what I call, capital is getting into what I call a spatial fix a lot of the time, which is what capital do is get a super amount of commodities and capacity in Britain, so it wouldn't know what to do with it. So the British would lend to Argentina to build railroads, and the railroads would be produced in Britain. So Argentina gets caught into the kind of the circulation of capital. So there were plenty of places like that for capital to grow into. But now there's no place left. I mean, maybe Africa still is not completely gone, but pretty much everywhere in the world has been caught into it right now. So growth from here on out is not feasible when it was feasible back in 1850.
Right. So even if someone had said, hold on a minute, if we have to indefinitely grow this ideology, it will necessarily bring about a destruction. And the response to that was, that'll be ages. Yeah. So no one was bothered.
Yeah. Well, back then, the United States was only just beginning, and you had the whole United States continent and the North American continent to occupy.
Would I be right then in asking, David, and beyond right, and more importantly than right, bloody clever in asking that capitalism is sourced from imperialism and colonialism? It's an economic model that fits the preceding ideology, which had been a rather more obviously unethical system of domination.
Yeah, I mean, capital has always been about geographical expansion. Now, whether you call it colonialism or you call it imperialism, I actually prefer to call it uneven geographical development, because sometimes imperialism is too simple a term. Oh. Because right now, if you look at the way in which commodities are made, one piece is made in Taiwan, one piece is made in South Korea, another piece is made in Mexico, and then it's all put together in the United States, and you say, where is capital in all of this? So right now it's a much more complicated kind of story. So I kind of saying, well, where's all this work going on, which is producing the commodities that get on our table? And one of the questions I always like to start my geography classes off with was questions of, where does your breakfast come from? And it was kind of really interesting. People kind of go, oh, I never thought about it. And they kind of say, well, it comes from the supermarket. And you say, no, I want to feel where all the stuff come from. And after about 3 weeks of asking the same question, people would say things like, I didn't have breakfast breakfast this morning?
I've stopped having it.
I stopped having breakfast.
To answer this question.
No, I don't like this question
I'm
about
not
whether my
hungry.
breakfast. No, I'm not hungry
I drank some water out of a puddle on the way here. But that rain, where did that cloud accumulate? And why was that cloud there? I'm not coming to your classes anymore. It's too hard.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. So I got a lot of dropouts from my geography class because I kept asking that question.
But in a way, capitalism is a vehicle for a particular type of mentality, which is kind of about what?
Well, it's, the famous kind of statement that greed is good. There's that kind of side to it. But actually the mentality now has shifted a bit, because I think a lot of capitalism is about a complicated relationship with the debtors. And one of the things that I'm talking about in this last book a lot is the way in which the future has got foreclosed by debt. That debt is a claim on future labour, and it's a claim on your future labour. And if you're heavily in debt, you've got to pay it off.
Yes.
So the incentive you have right now is not to kind of it's getting rid of the debt.
It's a drag, isn't it? I'm supposed to be rich and I'm enslaved.
Yeah. Well, this is exactly right. That it's about foreclosure, and it's about not emancipating you at all. It's about imprisoning you in a network of debt relations, which have become very different. That's why, student debt, in the States now we've got this horrible amount of student debt, which really forecloses the future for people in remarkable ways.
If you can remove morality from the lens of analysis, it's sort of ingenious in its mendacity, in the number of ways in which it's dominating.
Yeah, and by the way, Marx does not make a moral argument. No, it's not really essentially a moral argument. It's about the inevitability of mendacity.
Oh, bloody hell, cool. Hey, so bearing in mind that this is still the simple bit of the podcast, for me and one imagines you, but what is the difference between socialism, Marxism and communism? Is there a quick way of doing that?
Well, socialism, I think, is generally spoken of as a transitional system in which capitalism is put under sufficient constraints so that you have social democracy, and and I think traditionally it was seen as a stepping stone to full communism, which would lead to the abolition of the class relation between capital and labour, and the abolition of class privilege, and eventually, of course, the abolition of the capitalist state apparatus. So communism is seen as a further stage going beyond, whereas under socialism, elements of the capitalism would still exist. The market system would still be there. Money of the sort that we use and accumulate would still be there. But under communism, a lot of that would then disappear. Marxism, for me anyway, is a mode of analysis. That is a way of thinking, which is a critical way of thinking, and it says to you when you've got some sort of situation and you want to try to understand what the hell is happening, you don't get deceived by surface appearances, you don't get deceived by ideological kind of bluster. You do an analysis and for yourself, and you come up with an understanding of what's really going on here. And when you understand what's really going on here, you can then act against what is really happening in a deep way, rather than simply deal with surface symptoms.
I see. Subcutaneous analysis, not just observation of symptoms, because when you observe the symptoms, you're necessarily confined by the argument of the other.
Yeah, one of the things Marx said was, if everything was as it seemed to be on the surface, there would be no need for science. So we look at the sun, and it looks like the sun's going around the Earth, but we find out, well, it isn't. It's the Earth rotating. So
that's another podcast. Christ, better write that down.
So that's what Marx means by appearance,
yes.
and the reality behind it. So it's most scientists, I think, would recognise there's a difference between symptoms and what the underlying cause is, and most medical practitioners would recognise that difference. And Marx is constantly trying to do a forensic kind of inspection of a capitalist system to find out what these symptoms, which you see on the surface, like increasing inequality, where those symptoms are coming from in terms of what's producing them.
Yes, I see. May I ask, when recently we spoke to Al Gore. We spoke to Al Gore about climate change. Al Gore, talking to us about like how, in a sense, I suppose his raison d'etre and explicit mission, which seems to have some nobility about it, is to galvanise and enthuse people about being sort of responsible. But when I was talking to Al Gore, I kept thinking and in fact saying, yeah, but hold on a minute, if you need that to stop, can't you, isn't there got to be sort of some stern and definitive regulation of that, otherwise it will just carry on, and in this case defiant and absolute regulation of energy companies, certain kinds of trade, certain kinds of labour. So in Capital, is it dealing with saying, well, there's no point just asking people to turn the tap off while they clean their teeth? It's much more important to say, well, you can't have that amount of profit, you can't operate in that way. Is that what is that does that critique reach those kind of conclusions?
That's a very good point. I mean, my view of Al Gore is that he thinks that you can actually solve the climate change problem within the parameters of a capitalist system, and that he doesn't want to do away with capitalism. He's trying to protect capitalism from the consequences of climate change. Yeah. Whereas I take the view that the main producer of climate change is, of course, the driving force of capital accumulation. And until you've dealt with the driving force of capital accumulation, you're going to get all these promises about new technologies which are going to solve the problem and so on. But you're not going to get a fundamental kind of a solution without challenging capital itself.
So it's kind of futile, isn't it? And it's sort of using the means of a kind of a contemporary consumer society, in that it's about your individual choice, and usually individually recycle and individually make these kind of choices. Right. There's a thing I'm very interested in, and I keep asking people about it and they don't know, so I'll ask you. There's this thing I read Gandhi said. He went, this is him, there's no point us kicking out the British and then us just doing their job for them. What India is a country of 70,000 villages that's built on craft economies where everybody works all the time. We have to focus less on mass production and think instead of production for the masses. And to do this, we're going to have to break our spell with commodification. As long as people are thinking we've got to get more and more stuff, we're going to be in trouble. Now, that is where it starts to interface with the individual. But I like this thing he said about 70,000 village, each one autonomous, independent and trading only in excess and being where possible self-sufficient. What's he saying there, Gandhi? Is that coming from?
It's a utopian vision in some ways, and I'm not against utopian visions. You need that sort of thing. Out of order
if you were.
Yeah, right.
I hate utopia.
Oh, you do? Oh, I know. I kind of like a little bit of utopianism.
Yeah, once in a while, every half hour. No, I love it.
I don't entirely rely on it, and I think that what Gandhi's saying is that there is a way of organising production and consumption which is radically different from that which is given by the industrialisation model. And he was faced with Nehru and developmentalism, which was to bring in factories and solve the problem that way. And Gandhi's saying, no, there's another kind of solution. Where I think there's a problem with that is in a situation of very strong population change and population growth. Yeah, the 70,000 villages, but they're growing, and then and there are other issues which arise, like how do you deal with local famines under circumstances of that kind? I mean, if you get crop failures amongst, say, 20,000 villages in a certain part, then how do you support what happens there? So his assumption is that there'll never be a crop failure, whereas historically there are crop failures because of climate issues and other malpractices and things like that. So you need to have an organisation that can deal with the possibility of crop failures and can redistribute wealth between the villages when it's really necessary. And the other difficulty is when they're independent and autonomous villages, some of the villages will start to get very affluent and very rich, and some of them will get very poor. What are you going to do about the inequalities of incomes between different villages? So Gandhi didn't think about those sorts of things, and I think you have to think about a form of organisation that will put all those village economies together.
So you believe that like anarcho-syndicalism is, I suppose, a version of what Gandhi was talking about.
You could go to anarcho-syndicalism from what he's talking about. I don't think he would want that at all, but you could move in that direction. And of course, there's a lot of interest these days in solidarity economies and autonomous development in this place, and and there's a great faith in autonomy, that somehow or other autonomy is going to be the solution. And my answer to that is, I think autonomy is a good thing when you know what you're doing with it, but it's not the solution, because if you don't have relations between autonomous groups, you're going to get a great deal of inequality. You're going to get the famine problem. You're going to get all sorts of issues of this kind, which have to be solved by integrating local economies with each other in such a way that they can mutually support each other in times of difficulty.
And so so presumably what you're arguing for and what Capital is arguing for is the role of the state, that the state has to have a benevolent and redistributive role. Not that capitalism doesn't redistribute wealth.
Put it this way: there have to be mechanisms of redistribution and the like, and mutual support, and that has to be organised. Now, when you use the term state, we often think about the capitalist state, and I don't like the capitalist state, but we do need a form of governments and governmental interventions, and I like some of these things where they talk about, Murray Bookchin, for example, had this idea about municipal socialism and local socialism. That is, you'd have autonomous assemblies, but then there would be a super assembly that would start to deal with the relations between, and then you'd have a super assembly in which what's happening in say North America gets connected with what's happening in South Africa, and issues like climate change are addressed, because you need a global organization to deal with the climate change problem. It's not going to be dealt with simply by everybody changing behaviour, as you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
So you need some form of governmental structure of coordination, and I think the autonomy argument is powerful up to a point, but it needs to go much further. When I say that, then people say, "Oh, you're in favour of the capitalist state, and you just want to give state power." And we know the state is a disaster, and yes, well, the current state is a disaster. It's an instrument of capitalist domination, and more so, I think, now than it was even in the 19th century. And we see it being militarized, so it can suppress social opposition and social movements. And so, I'm really against the kind of capitalist state. But that doesn't mean I'm against some sort of form of government that can deal with these much broader global kind of problems.
How would we ever arrive at that? How would we have a form of state that was benevolent and acting in the interests of its population? And can you now answer a question you must be continually called upon to answer, that where, I'm glad that you did this distinctions between socialism, Marxism and communism. How do you address the great failures of communism in the last century?
Well, first off, I don't think necessarily that communism was a great failure.
I mean, like all the, Stalinism, gulags.
Yes, there were, some very, very bad parts of that history. On the other hand, I think what was interesting was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, life expectancy in the Soviet Union went down in Russia, enormously. A lot of people there suddenly found all their rights had disappeared. I mean, so I think we are wrong to kind of say everything that the communists did was terrible.
You think that mostly I've been propagandized, like that my perception of what happened in the communist Soviet Union over that century has been editorialized, and I don't really understand it, because it does. I mean, because I don't know only the information.
Look, I'm not. I don't want to get in a situation of saying everything was great and wonderful and no criticism. But if you look at a place like Cuba and you look at healthcare delivery in Cuba, it's fantastic.
Yeah, there's a good vibe as well.
Education, and so there's some very good things there.
There clearly are some good things, but I think don't we have to address some of the things that seem like, I saw this good thing on the telly once where the woman that was doing the documentary said, it seems that communism, Soviet communism, unconsciously or inadvertently mimicked the social structure that had immediately preceded it of Tsarism, in spite of its declared objectives. It had hierarchical structures and did lead to oppression and persecution of a sort of
Yeah, no, I don't deny a lot of that, but I do think that we have to, give credibility to some of the things that happened under communism. And the other thing I have to say is this. The reason that most of us have the standard of living we have today is because of the communist threat. If the communist threat had not been there after 1945, we wouldn't have had the delivery of the welfare state such as it was and all those kinds of things which allow us increasing life expectancy. And it's interesting that over the last few years, life expectancy has been going down in some of the major capitalist countries. Britain, for example, Cameron, I think, is the first prime minister to leave with a lower life expectancy than when he came in.
Well, I think his has gone up. You should see the armed guards outside his house. Yes. Nothing's happening to that geezer. Let me tell you, there's old Bill crawling around everywhere. And there's an ambulance on duty. So I don't know what's happened to everyone else in Ladbroke Grove. They must be terrified. All the old Bill are outside one house.
Right.
But look, David, this is the thing, because I basically, my position, amorphous though it may be, and is substantiated as it will continue to be, is this, that we need radical change.
Yes.
And part of that does seem to be the dismantling of the capitalist state and a new system based on sharing. But when we even appear to have an allegiance to like anything, an umbrella under which, Stalinism or, me, I'd love a bit of Che Guevara, but you can't try saying that in Miami. People, the kickback's pretty fierce. Because of the flaws and because of I grew up in the 80s and Cold War, which was obviously a tale of the two sides. So I find it very hard to unpick that, and anything that seems revivalist or nostalgic about communism that's already happened. I think people are like, no thanks, mate.
I don't want to do that. I mean, I've been interested in some of these programs that, for example, in northern Syria, the Kurds have reorganized things along a kind of assembly structures, partly inspired by an alternative notion of democracy. I think that right now some of the progressive mayors in Spain are trying to come up with a way of creating more democratic assembly structures. So I think there's a lot of experimentation that needs to be done on things like that. I think the big problem with communism was they had what I call a single bullet theory of social change, which was put in classic Marxist terms that the productive forces, that is, if you could command production, then the rest of society would take care of everything in a proper kind of way. I think we have to work on a whole range of different issues, including sort of culture, relation to nature. We have to deal with a problem right now which is fundamental to me, which is what I would call global alienation, the alienation of populations politically, from their jobs, from their daily life possibilities, and you've got alienated populations all over the world who then do crazy things sometimes. They can be passive for a while and then something happens and you get these sort of seemingly irrational outbreaks of craziness, and they elect Donald Trump and do things like that. So I think alienation is one of the big issues. And when you have populations that are alienated, then you can't address it by sort of saying, "Oh, vote communist," because people are as alienated from political parties like the communist parties and so on as they are from anything else. So it's hard then to rebuild some sort of trust with alienated populations, and that's a lot of political work to do. And I think there's an interesting distinction for me between what might be called social media as a form of communication and social media leading to forms of organization. The communicative forms are very good. The organizational forms are very bad right now. And we've really got to think about how to construct organizational forms. And I agree with you entirely. I'm not nostalgic about, what the communists did, except that, when it comes to healthcare and that kind of thing, I'd say, well, we should look at how the Cubans did it. And education, we should look at how the Cubans did it. Yes,
I understand. You're enamored by the beauty of the original idea, the veracity of the critique, and the possibility of components of it.
You said that great. Can somebody take that down? So that's what I'm interested in.
It's all been recorded. It's all been recorded.
Okay.
Thank you. That's the endorsement. That's going on the poster. You said that. Great. I'm going to give that in as my PhD. I'm not doing a PhD. I'm doing the other one that begins with M. I'm really going to have to start listening in those lectures. that you like that. And the compliment, I'm so ego-led. If someone's nice to me, it takes me about an hour to recover my graces because I've been given a compliment. Let's just take a while to reflect on the compliment, and then we'll move on with the interview. Now, my point is that what's needed is something that, whilst it may be derived from a capital, a book that I've only just learned to say correctly, and now you've making me undo it, that I suppose, David, the thing that sort of that interests me, the reason that I'm doing this podcast is I sense that change is possible. I sense that we are being lied to. I can feel the argument that you made about alienation. It's so in evidence. And I went to that Cuba when I was quite young, 22, and it was magnificent. I was there, of all things, to record a chewing gum commercial, the most vacuous product imaginable, not even nutrition, just the act of mastication as a ritual and an idea while people starve. And while there, luckily I'm a drug addict, so that was then, I'm clean now. So that means that wherever I go, I have to go and find the people that know where the drugs are. So that means you have to get off the rails, you have to go down the rabbit hole. So I found myself in these things called barrios in Havana, and I liked it. I liked the people, and I liked the murals, and there was a sense of joy and glory and potentiality, and cars from the 50s, why not? And streets painted by people, and this presence of people and people's creativity. Right. And as you say, the absence of that alienation that comes when you don't participate in your city, when you don't participate in your culture, when you know you have no power, when you know you have no meaning, how lost you feel. I felt something different then, but I was on drugs, so all of my experiences were being filtered through drugs. And that's before I knew that they had bloody good dental care. All of that. But what I feel like when we're posing an idea to people now, I think what did Lenin, Trotsky, the Bolsheviks, etc., take from that book Capital and use in the revolution in communism, and how did it become, the failure that it became, even if you take as failure the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, and what's happening in Russia now?
Yeah. See, that's a question I often get asked and I back away from. I kind of say, look, Lenin and Trotsky and Bukharin and all these people, they read Capital and they took certain things from them and they did certain things from them. Our job right now is to read Capital and find out what we want to do with it.
What shall we do?
Yeah, well,
first
off, you've got to learn how to read it, and that is not initially an easy thing. That's why I hope some of the things I write help people get into it.
That's going to be vital because no one's going to read it. You're going to have to do that. That's really important.
Yeah, and I have these things on the web where you can do there's a course on Marxist Capital, Volume 1 and Volume 2 on the web, and you can take it on the web. So open it up. But in the process, make sure that we understand what it is that Marx is really teaching us about the nature of this system. And that comes back to it's not what it appears to be on the surface. Can we develop a way of critique so that I want to educate people if I can, not necessarily to regurgitate Marx, because that's not the point, but to use his mode of an analysis so that you can start to see, okay, these populations are alienated. Why are they alienated? Where does the alienation come from? What's it got to do with the nature of the labour process? Why is the labour process the way it is these days? Why did capitalist technology decide that it wanted a labour process which disempowered the labourer? Why is that there? Yeah. Why is it and Marx has this wonderful thing where he starts off one of his chapters and he says, John Stuart Mill has this problem. He says, look, we have all this labour-saving machinery right now, and you would have thought this labour-saving machinery would lighten the load of labour. And John Stuart says, but the funny thing is it seems that it doesn't. That actually it makes a lot of the labourer worse. And Marx says, well, of course it does, because the purpose of the machinery is not to lighten the load of labour, it's to extract more value and more surplus value and more profit from the labourer. So, of course, if the machine can help you do that, then that's what it does.
Yes.
So this gives you an understanding of capitalist technology, which evaded John Stuart Mill, but which Marx sees very clearly,
yes.
and we see very clearly, and say, actually, the purpose of technological change, yeah, well, I mean, there are all kinds of purposes, but with military and all the rest of it in there, but one of the big purposes of it is to disempower the labourer.
Yes. Yes.
And when the labourer is disempowered, guess what? They become alienated.
Yes.
Guess what? They start behaving in an alienated way. You know, I mean, when you've got these things sort of going on, you're kind of saying, well, these are the kinds of insights that come out of reading Marx's Capital. And you kind of go, wow, you know, once I've got that insight, I can't look at any discussion of technological change and imagine it's got some socialist utopia attached to it, as, you know, some of the people writing these days do. The artificial intelligence is the new socialist utopia. You know, well, you see what happens. Something like Uber starts as a kind of sharing economy, and the next thing you know, it's become capitalized, and somebody's become a billionaire out of it.
You've got to admire the malleability of the system. It is good, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying capitalism good morally, ethically, or spiritually.
It's slick. It's very adaptable.
Slick. Anything. It can take anything. Yeah. Like, my understanding of it is primarily of the way that it interacts with culture and creativity, and how you can see mimicked in its narrative the essential flaw, i.e., for example, take hip-hop, which begins as sort of very defiant, then goes for a stage of being utopian and beautiful, and then becomes commodified, becomes clearly a product, and to some degree about products and about commerce and about acquisition and about, like, the ideology is so endemic, it's so all-encompassing that it becomes invisible. So you say that part of capitalism's DNA is its own concealment. Its own concealment is a primary function. Once it's concealed itself, it can continue. Now, what I think is, you know, when people talk about, you know, the system and the flaws with the system, obviously, when you say, you know, about technology's role, it's technology, you know, John Stuart Mill's all baffled by it, but Marx goes, no, it's doing its job perfectly. Or is that not true of bureaucracy and systems of control? For someone, this system, for some people, for some groups, some institutions, this system is brilliant. It's working 100% effectively. Right. Oh yeah, but what about climate change? No problem. What about alienation, inequality, riots, death, murder, decimation? No problem. So who is this strata for whom this system is beneficial? Who are they? How do we influence, control, diminish, limit, oppose them?
That's the subject of your PhD. That's what you've got to do. That's what you've got to sort out. No, I mean, I can give some preliminary sort of answers to those questions.
Write this down.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, you're in a great position to take that sort of stuff on.
Am I?
Big time. Yeah, because you know, you're close. I mean, it's very important when you're doing a PhD to be in love with the matter you're doing, you know, because otherwise
Russell Brand, myself by me.
Yeah. which is fine, which is what it should be about in some ways. So I think it's but yeah, who benefits? Well, you can see who extracts wealth from it. I mean, how wealth gets, you know, how Jeff Bezos gets his money, and how he's the guy who runs Amazon,
right?
And
bloody good though, aren't they, Amazon? But they're part of the problem. They won't pay any bloody tax. They're too bloody big. They're controlling everything. Yeah. So that would have to go.
And how Google and all these other monopolies are kind of being set up. So they've been set up in such a way, and actually, you know, I use them. You know,
how can we not?
Use them. We have to use them. At the same time, value is being extracted from us. Kind of rent is being taken away from us, and so we've got these systems now, which you know, and I think particularly in the cultural field and so on, the forms of exploitation and appropriation are becoming, you know, pretty chronic. I mean, they've been that way for quite a while, but it seems to me, right now, particularly given the problems that I mentioned earlier, that capital is running out of places to go and new things to do.
Just geographically.
And actually it's increasingly relying upon, you know, culture, to the production and commodification of culture.
What do you mean? What does that mean? What do you mean by that, the commodification of culture?
Well, for example, if we want to have a short turnover time of something, then a spectacle is instantaneously consumed. It's gone. It's not like my grandmother's knives and forks. It doesn't last 150 years, you know. It's just, the Olympic Games or something like that becomes a big mode of capital accumulation. Vast amounts of money goes into rebuilding the infrastructures and doing all the things that the construction interest wants to do.
Yeah.
Then the Olympic Games are 10 days. It's all gone. Where's the next games?
And we've got that running track round our pitch.
and how many biennales are there now? And every city has a biennale exhibition, a cultural, you know, like Venice exhibition or the Shanghai exhibition, and so you suddenly find the whole kind of cultural realm is being used as a sort of commodification, real estate development kind of a scam.
Yes. So it's like, I see. It's like that there's a matrix of commodification that's applied to everything, and you can see its fingerprints, if it would have anything as organic as fingers, on everything. Yes. Like football being a great example. Yes. How, like, you know, if you listen to Talk Sport, which is obviously, I think, now owned by sort of Sky and stuff, the sort of delicious, cruel irony of like what everyone is talking about all the time is, it's just the whole game's about bloody money. It's the whole game's about money. And like the way that sort of like the way that football looks now, and of course the amount players earn, but I mean that's one of the few ways that working class person has a chance of earning any money is to become a world class footballer. But so that's not my point. But my point is that somehow the essence of the game is surviving this process of commodification. How the experience is being turned into a product. How even its roots in community, its tribal roots, its roots as a congregational activity, a space for union and togetherness is going layer after layer of commerce wrapped around it. The players appearing in the adverts, the adverts on the shirts. You know, how long before the pitch has adverts on it? How long? You know, like sort of it's creeping through our consciousness. It's everywhere. And one of the things I think as well is I feel like growing up when I commodify people. I think I have to consciously unstitch my tendency to look at people and think, well, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to give me something? Can I have sex with you? I'm not thinking this now, David. I've changed. I'm married now. Like, I try not to look at people as commodities. Right. That's one of the things, one of the flaws. You know, you talk about on one hand the alienation that people understand. Oh no, I'm absolutely expendable. My role is meaningless. I am only a piece of this machinery, an organic piece of matter in a machine. But the other side of that is that we start to look at each other as commodities, that we lose the lens of humanity. Yeah,
if you said to me, you know, what's the central kind of politics I'd like to see, I'd say I want a politics of decommodification. That is, what's happened over the last 30, 40 years, education has become more and more of a commodity. It should stop being a commodity. It should be a free good to everybody. Healthcare is a commodity. It should be a free good to everybody. In other words, we should start to decommodify whole sectors of the economy. Now that's socialism. That's not communism. That's socialism. That's a socialist project. And you're right. We should also start decommodifying others, so that we start to look at others as people instead of instruments of our own, our own activities and trying to exploit. Because
if our economic ideology requires that it does things as sort of biological and psychological as stimulate limitless need and desire in order to perpetuate itself, then it has also colonized the consciousness and the lives of the individuals beyond their economic role, because it requires their spiritual role be beholden to its ideology also.
No, and I think the decolonization and the decommodification, those are the kinds of general fields of endeavor which we can start to do things on right now.
How do we do it?
Well, we can even get the Labour Party to start to go really strongly. abolish student debt, for example.
There was talk of this.
There's talk of it, yeah. Well, stop having talk about it. Do
that.
Do the same with, make sure that there's enough money goes into healthcare so that it's really a non-commodified sector, and you get rid of the secondary kind of privatized thing, which the conservatives...
Get rid of
that. Yeah, so the conservatives, want to use that as a way of sort of chewing away at the National Health Service so that you don't, So there are real politics that can have short even in the short term, or you can imagine sort of a radical beginning. And if people start to think in terms of decommodification, just over something like education or healthcare, and you can extend it a bit more to housing, and then actually the basic food, which the Cubans did, by the way.
Oh, yes.
With a ration book, and their ration book gave you a certain basic amount of rice and so on, and it's not working too well right now, but it was a basic food kind of allocation that everybody had. So do things like this, and
Professor,
and we could do it.
When like the people come out of a cult, like Scientology or another cult, they have to sit them down with someone who goes, all that stuff you've been wired up with, it's not true. They come back to your mum and dad or whatever it is. Now, how are we going to unstitch the conditioning generation deep? When I sometimes, just to make myself feel better, really go and talk to young people and give them, bend their ears about my views. One of the things that's very difficult for me, as someone, I'm in my 40s now, and I feel like I'm a person that has access to the young, and I feel like I can affect people, is to recognise how they are indoctrinated. They want the phone. Don't tell them that they don't want the phone, because they want it. How much you earn. So they think about money. Why would they not? How could they not? How do we begin to? Because see, this thing you said, the thing you like most about Marxist analysis is that its veracity and its ability to deconstruct, critique, and reveal essence, epiphany, the revelation of essence. The revelation of real truth. How are we gonna wade through the layers of inculcation that lacquers their minds?
I think you start in various ways. I think Marx's answer to this is, first off, you should start to try to identify certain kind of practices, which are very simple practices, over things like, using people in instrumental ways instead of relating to them as human beings. That these changes can, so the realm of practices is very important, and that can be all over the place. The second thing is to start to actually have a political movement which kind of says, we don't have to actually create human beings of the sort that we're creating right now with a kind of neoliberal ethic and all of that, and we can do things rather differently and get people to read. You mentioned Gandhi. People sometimes read Gandhi and get really transformed by it in terms of starting to think about the world in a different kind of way. And so there's an educational process which then gets embedded in a political movement, and I think that then starts to be important, and that political movement can start to have effects by orchestrating new forms of governance and democracy and the like. For instance, if you look at what's going on in Barcelona, you've got a radical mayor, and she's trying to set up kind of new forms of democratic consultation within the city.
Is it working there?
It's
I know that Spain's been in crisis, hasn't it?
Yes, it's only just started. They only just started working on this, but this is one of the projects they have. So, but that project comes out of a bunch of people who started to develop small practices on the ground, who got together and kind of said, look, we need to do something really radically different. The mayor comes out of the anti-foreclosure movement. She's very, very progressive, and she's got a bit of a progressive alliance behind her, and so new things can be set up. And it's very interesting to me. I'm interested in urban. There's a lot of radical mayors around the world. Even places like Seattle and Los Angeles have radical councils now who are starting to do things at a very different level, just at the local level. And this is the way in which a political movement can't be taught from the top down. It's got to it's got to develop organically somehow.
I agree with you.
In people's daily lives.
Do you not think that means, to a degree, then, that power has to be closer to people, and that?
Yes.
And then so the idea of state power, even if apparently benevolent, is always going to seem somehow abstract.
Yes. And then to me it's more a dialectical kind of relationship between some sort of centralized state power. So somebody like who's a mayor of a city has a certain kind of centralized power, but it rests very much upon local neighborhood movements. Then what happens is those movements try to do certain things, and they get support. They need crucial support from what the mayor can do. So if you want to develop a new housing complex, which is a non-commodity housing development of affordable housing, you probably need the city to help you acquire the land. And if the city helps you acquire the land, then the city is doing its job. So there's a relationship of certain kind between these different levels of
Jim, could you find my most recent text messages from John Rogers? Because he's talking about some people that are trying to buy some house. My mate John Rogers, he's the first communist I ever met when I was a young man. He started filling my head with silly dreams of utopia. he sent me something recently about some campaign where people are trying to buy their own land and develop it. Do you think then that what you're saying, is it curious, do you think, David, that this sort of forms of more localised or at least citywide government, for me, I would take with my particular code that's an indication that what's required is decentralised, more decentralised power, and perhaps this is the end of the nation state. I mean, when you sort of look at what's happening in America and in certain strands of British politics, can you see perhaps that within the Brexit impulse, sort of a certain positivity in that people want to unpick themselves? I know there's many reasons for Brexit or whatever, but on some level, it's a kind of decentralisation, power being closer to people having a degree of authority in their own lives.
Yeah, but I don't believe in a decentralisation as an absolute. I mean, because actually it turns out that one of the best ways you can orchestrate centralised control is through decentralisation. When you think about it, and the market is a very decentralized system, and of course it's actually compatible with incredible concentrations of political and economic power. So I don't think decentralization in itself is the answer. I think that some level of in a situation where there's not any decentralization, we go for decentralization.
It's centralized by its ideology, though, isn't it? It has such a clear mandate. It's such a simplistic mandate: extract profit. Like, you know, that itself is geographical. It's like it can't be contained. You can't, and I suppose any attempts to regulate it at a national level or local level are always resisted. Yeah. Now, another thing is, say, like, for a moment when you said there, like, that if we had a political party that was, like, you know, overtly committed to, you know, sort of like, you know, some of the basics, how do you think in government such a nation and such an ideology would survive, like after what happened in Greece and Syriza and all that?
Well, you know, again, that's one of the big issues. You get these very progressive movements, and they get political power, and then they find political power is constrained in certain ways, and the finances are such that they have to do things, so they become just like, you know, everybody else. And we've seen that, you know, with the history of the Labour Party. When it came into power, it started to be very much more, you know, pro-capitalist. So I think at that point, the whole kind of revolutionary impulse has to be taken more seriously, and to say a reformist party should look to create what I would call revolutionary reforms. Now, those reforms which open the pathway towards further reform, you know.
Would those reforms be, what would you prioritise? The establishment of, like, benevolent state institutions around health and education, I can see how important that is, but is it not equally important, given what we've discussed, that to have powerful draconian regulation of enterprise? Yeah,
no, I'm not against regulating what the capitalist class is doing. I'm very much in favour of.
What does that sound like?
Well, it sounds like, for example, that you put strict rules on pollution, and you put strict rules on things like occupational safety and health conditions in factories and the like. So
strict regulation around their behaviour. So that, you know,
and actually those.
Around pay as well.
I mean, I would like to see what kind of world would it be if actually something like the Mondragon principle, which started out, well, it's a big cooperative that became bigger and bigger and bigger, and originated in Spain, and the rule was that the salary differential should be no more than 1 to 3.
Oh, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Now, recently it's gone to 1 to 9, so you see the kind of pressures on it. But 1 to 3. Imagine if all corporations had to work under the rule that the rate of return to people in the corporation should not be more than 1 to 3. Right now, big corporation heads get something like 300 or 400 times what the average.
They're going to hate that idea.
Of course they're going to hate that idea.
But they're earning millions. Wait, hold on.
But you legislate it and so kind of say, okay, here's the situation.
Yes.
And we'll be living in a radically different world if hey, you know, and right now it's scandalous. I mean, you have this scandal also going on here about, you know, how much the heads of universities are paid.
Oh, is there a scandal?
Yeah.
They're earning a lot, are they?
They're earning huge amounts, yeah. And
Why? Because
at the same time, they're cutting back on number of faculty they hire. Because
it's very seductive, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's very seductive. Everyone gets lured in.
Yeah. Become a.
I've been lured right in. It's very difficult not to get lured in.
Yep.
Like you sort of like I knew it was wrong prior to having money, and I knew also that it wouldn't work as well. And then when you sort of get it, the comfort, you see, the seduction of comfort, the illusion of it.
I confess I have some of that too.
Do you? And that's why I thank you very much. That's why there's a component to this I always harp on about, where the only way to engender real change, deep change, is not through. I don't think is through analysis and critique, because I think people sort of know. I think they know, but for them to understand that change is possible, I think you have to make people feel differently.
Yeah.
And there's sort of the antithesis of the alienation that you just described.
No, there's a moment in any kind of revolutionary process where you're right. If people don't feel differently, then it's gone. Yes.
So I wonder how. You mentioned as well, there is the possibility for mass communication. There are some. One of the things I was trying to do when I was more overtly involved in political conversation is I was trying to find grandstand, flash, obvious, blatant, blunt things that people thought, oh my God, you could do that. And one of the things, that group called Adbusters, they would sort of say things like kill a corporation, and there's something about it made me sort of tingle with excitement. Is that they would say, identify a corporation that is not popular, campaign, sort of almost like when we're campaigning for hospitals or on behalf of unions, it exists within a milieu that they know how to manage. I feel like a targeted campaigner was like, our role is we are going to crash, collapse, undermine, disassemble. Apple was a difficult one because we've all got them and they're so bloody popular.
Yes.
We've all got them. We're all tacked up in it.
Right.
But do you see that there could be these ideas? Is there any potential for that? To introduce these kind of ideas? Because it's hard for me to look at Google and Amazon with animosity. Even though I know, why don't they pay their taxes? Why won't they? Because I like those logos, those brands, those stories, the convenience, the comfort. It's so seductive, David. How do you people when I talk to black cab drivers, I'm like, yeah, bloody hell, one of the few ways that working people can have an honest job. And then Uber, so creepingly convenient.
Right.
What do we do? How do you ask people, how do you get people to change the way they see the world without some sort of different vehicle into their hearts?
Well, you can boycott Uber or something like that. That would be an interesting way. In fact, they did get boycotted in New York City. It was very interesting.
Oh, really?
It was a day when Trump declared that no Muslims were allowed from those countries, and everybody was rushing out to the Kennedy airport to sort of, lawyers and all this kind of stuff were turning up there. And the regular cab drivers went on strike for an hour. So and I actually arrived in Kennedy Airport when all this was happening. It was impossible to get out because the cab drivers, but Uber broke the strike. And Uber came in, and next day, social media was coming out and says, boycott Uber. Next day, Uber lost half its passengers. Because they undermined the cab drivers' strike over the immigrant population, and I thought it was very interesting that happened. So there are ways to go with this.
Opportunities will arise to illustrate these points,
and I think sometimes these symbolic things are very important, and I'm all in favour of any kind of symbolic action. I mean, I think the Occupy movement was a symbolic movement, and I think it actually changed the discourse about inequality. It introduced the concept of the 1% into everybody understand it. And so, a lot of people were in the Occupy movement say it was a terrible, terrible failure. And you say, no, it wasn't a failure. I mean, it did some things which were terribly important.
Yeah, too soon to tell, as they say.
Yeah, right.
may I run through the proper questions, so that make sure that we've covered everything? Because you're so fascinating.
Well, no, I'm enjoying it too. So
yeah. Hello, we're loving it in here. Right. So Marx's Capital, one of the most important texts of the modern era, changed the destiny of countries, politics, people across the world. What are its key arguments? We better pick that up. I feel like we've covered it a bit, but do you think we've covered that?
Yeah, I think we've covered that. It's about commodification and it's about accumulation of capital, circulation of capital, and how it has to grow, and technological change and dynamism and all of that. We've done a lot on that.
We've understood that. Do its ideas, the ideas of Das Kapital, continue to resonate today? And if so, what do they still offer?
Well, we talked about that too, because we said, capital is more prevalent around the world now than it was back then. So in some ways, Marx is more important now because the terrain on which it operates is much bigger.
Covered that. Socialism, Marxism, Communism, definitely done that. Considering the degree to which technological, economic and industrial change has occurred within the last 150 years, how might Marx's analysis and its application need to be modified? Do you want to do a little bit more of that?
I think that the answer to it is not much. It's pretty accurate.
You're orthodox.
It's a good. No, the thing is that Marx wrote a lot about what was going on in the 19th century, and that's dated. But he's when he's writing about capital, he's writing about a system which still exists, and which is even more powerful now than it was in his day. So,
and in fact, possibly we can now see how it's played out.
Yes,
we go, bloody hell, he said that was going to happen.
Now, there are some aspects that Marx never got around to finishing doing on, for example, finance and the role of finance, where he wrote some very fascinating stuff, but he never completed it. But we need to do that right now because the financial question is a much bigger question now than it was in his day.
Yes, thank you. Your work is said to be appreciated by anarchists and the Occupy movement as much as it is by Leninist party organisers. Why do you think this is?
I have no idea, and you should ask them.
Yeah, that's right. Well done for not being vain. You shouldn't have put that question in there, Gal. That makes us look sycophantic. I'm going to cross that out. Right, leave it in the show, though. It makes us look authentic. How has your anthropological and geographical background informed your teaching of Marx? That's really good.
Yeah,
I want to know that. Actually,
I mean, I have a rather different take on Marx to a lot of people, and the reason is that I'm not primarily interested in Marx. I'm primarily interested in urbanization, uneven geographical development at world scale, local scale, and things of that kind. And I the only thing I like about Marx is it helps me understand all of that. Now, when there's something in Marx that doesn't help me understand all of that, I kind of push it to one side and say, I think this is probably a useless bit of Marx.
Yeah, so I'm
very much about Marx as a practical guide rather than as a grand theoretician who's a pure theory person. So
that's because you come from different disciplines in anthropology and geography.
Yeah, right. And thank God I'm not an economist.
Yeah, that stuff's boring, isn't it? And it's made up, and it's not a science, and it's all just pretend. Now, what about I like that breakfast thing that we were doing. Like that you say, where'd your breakfast come from? It's good, isn't it? Like, because you sort of don't really think, oh, no, these beans, so it's probably been through hell. And like that egg, oh no, it's all sorts has gone on.
Yeah.
Put you off it. Never mind a cocoa pop.
Where does sugar come from?
Yeah. Tate and Lyle, that couple of rapscallions, wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. They've still got the whip marks in their hands. So it's been said we're entering a post-capitalist era. Do we still live in a capitalist society? I can answer that one just after. Of course we do. It's got worse than ever. Oh, it's something that's worse than capitalism, maybe you could say. Some sort of terrible behemoth, some cyborg, some horrible monster.
It was always a pretty horrible monster. So it's a monster that has some good effects sometimes.
Yeah. Beyonce, iPhones, I don't know, like there's some good bits, not blaming Beyonce. Will the current system ultimately prove to be fatal to us?
I wish I could say yes, but the trouble is the capital can continue under the most dire conditions if people don't change it, and that's the point, that people have got to change it. It ain't going to change. It ain't going to change of its own accord.
Right, to change. What are some of the main contradictions at the heart of capitalism? We really covered that with the growth and the dynamism, Gareth. I can't believe that because Gareth he's the producer.
Yeah, well, he's been reading it very hard.
Could you ever love me? Gareth, where are you going with these? What about the argument that says capitalism's contradictions lead to the innovations that made it resilient? That's good. Where'd you get that from?
Yeah, well, look, there's a lot of invention going on under capitalism, and some of it's very useful. I mean, what would we do without Velcro and things like that, I mean,
Velcro? That's your example?
Well, it's trivial things like that, but on the other hand, if you're struggling and you've got a broken arm and you need to fix it up and you've got Velcro, boy, is it good.
Oh, that's the most I've wanted to cuddle you in this entire interview. You write about how cities are both the heart of capital and class struggles. You write about how cities of both capital You write about how cities are the heart of both capital and class struggles. How might cities be reorganised in more socially just and ecologically sane ways?
Well, that's one of the big projects I think that we've got to have, is how to redesign cities so that they're much more available to the population, where they counter the alienations which currently exist about urban life. And actually, it's interesting, if you look at it, over the last 30 years, most of the big movements going around the world have been urban movements, like Gezi Park, about what happened in Brazil in 2013, and even Occupy was a lot of it was about housing and urban questions, and not about what's going on in the factory.
That's interesting. I wonder what that means.
It means that actually that people are as concerned about the qualities of urban life as they are about the qualities of their employment.
Yes.
They've always been involved in both, but one of the things that Marx was a bit biased towards is he biased towards production, and not necessarily
because of the time he was writing, probably.
So I would always want to correct that a bit in Marx.
Also, perhaps because now the kind of economies in which these movements are occurring, there is no longer sort of mass production in the manner in which there was when Marx was writing. Now people are working more diverse.
Well, in many parts of the world, the working class, in the sense of factory labourer, has disappeared as being central. And of course, not in China or Bangladesh and so on, but in North America, the traditional working class has been much diminished.
Yeah, he said, what did he say? Paul Gilbert, was it Paul Gilbert? He said lanyard, the sort of the lanyard class.
Right.
He talked about as the new sort of working class. That's a sort of interesting thing we heard when we were doing the interviews. Sales of Das Kapital, capital as we now call it, crossing out that D and making that kicking a curly-cur, have soared since the 2008 crash. Is Marxism on the rise?
I think there's a much greater interest in it. And I think the nadir was in the 1990s, when it was very hard to get anybody to ever look at Marx's Capital. But I think since 2000, it's gradually become important, and then the crisis of 2007, 2008. Yeah.
Here's some of these big arguments against communism. In the 20th century, it's been directly responsible for killing 100 million people. Did it?
Yes, there's a lot of things that can be, very negative things,
like religion, that
Stalin, and of course Mao made a huge mistake, which led to the Great Famine in China, where about 20 million people died.
Mao, focus.
But on the other hand, it also saved a lot of lives. I mean, the interesting thing about the China case, and people get mad at me when I say this, 20 million people probably died in the famine, which was unnecessary, bad policies and all that. On the other hand, when Mao came to power, life expectancy in China was 35, and when he died, life expectancy was 65. So he did something right as well as...
Yes, I see. You feel like it's your personal role to redress much of the propagandized information that's taken as fact.
And then the problem with the propaganda is it emphasises all the negatives, and it never says anything about what the positives were. And
we need new, more balanced propaganda. On the other hand, I understand. 1, capitalist economies are based on free exchange. This is a popular claim of capitalism. Is that true? Is it made up?
Well, in principle it is, but in practice, a lot of it is monopoly power.
Monopoly power, plus even people's the role of the consumer. They've been stimulated into a terrible state of desperation. All right. I think we've covered. I think that's such a thorough interview I've done. Now, can I just before? I mean, not that we let you go. You're continued to be free. But my mate John Rogers sent me this thing. Check out this and see if it makes sense. Like a blah, blah, blah. I'm emailing you in respect of this project. We're hoping you could speak to Russell about. Here, I'm Russell, and probably close to his heart this is. A number of people in Haringey have formed a company with the aim of buying a large bit of land that will otherwise be sold to a private developer. They will want to build loads of expensive housing in a part of Haringey, Tottenham. I mean, just let's call it North London to not antagonise most of the other people in London. Where just a bit of football insight. Where local people can't afford them, thus gentrifying the area and kicking out local people. What we want to do is build 800 homes that are all genuinely affordable for local people, and the site controlled by local people. Oh, hello. I could go on, he says, but if you need more info, you can go to the website startharingey.co.uk. We're actually serious about this. That's a funny paragraph to put this late in. And we've got solicitors, architects. We've been speaking to the mayor. Blah 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 blah. We need to pile on pressure and publicity. So, what do you think about a project like that, where essentially, I suppose their project is to have sort of to acquire some land, to build 800 homes and sort of govern them. So again, it's going to be operating within like a metropolis that's got other systems of government at its heart.
I'd like to know more details.
Right,
about
you don't
it.
just make snap judgments like a problem, like an agony uncle. Communist agony uncle.
I would support this kind of thing. I mean, in the States we have something called community land trust, which means that people who are in those houses can't sell them. So I don't know whether that's in that proposal. Whether people,
I bet it is. Yeah, they can't turn a quick profit on there.
No, so if people come in and they live there, then if they leave, then they just get back what they put in, and there's no kind of speculation on the land. So anything of that sort, I'm in favour of.
Yeah, where people have authority and power in their own lives and the ability to govern themselves where possible. But
you sometimes find in those things where people look at the situation and say, well, under the rules of the game, I can't sell. But if I could sell, I could make megabucks. So therefore, the individuals try to then turn those collective things into things where they can speculate and come out. I mean,
it's curious, isn't it? Because in a way, capitalism, like most superficial and observable phenomena, are somehow sourced from our inner lives. Fear, greed.
Well, it's partly that, but then if somebody's living there and they see that if they could make this turn this back into a market proposition, they could make a lot of money out of it. Then and they've got pressing needs, medical needs or something like that, or they, then they want to go market.
Yes, I see.
So it's not just greed and ideology and so on. People have real kind of needs. So.
I suppose that's why you are insistent on there being some kind of state role, so that there is some sort of overarching principle, so that people
they have to have
protected.
A legal apparatus there that prevents them selling out at a market rate.
That's some free advice from David Harvey that you've got there from your email. That was someone called Tony Wood, who's a friend of my mate John Rogers. And finally, what 5 books have we got to read, please?
That's a terrible...
Well, you won't do it?
Terrible thing. Well, I can do it. But, you should get into reading this stuff from all kinds of different perspectives. And the sorts of things that I would sort of say is, if you read C.L.R. James on Black Jacobins, this is a kind of...
What does that mean? What is that?
It's an understanding of Marx that comes from the colonial experience, put it that way. And so anybody who's coming from that background, I think, would immediately get sucked into sort of appreciating the Marxist standpoint from that experience. I'd say the same thing about somebody like Silvia Federici, who has a book on Caliban and the Witch, and another more recent one called Point Zero, which is about the experience of women in the whole history of capital accumulation from the very origins to today. Again, people would get into that and they would get a certain perspective on the Marxist position, which would come from that. And then from a humanist position, I'd say read Terry Eagleton's book on why Marx was right, where he actually goes over the whole history of Marx's humanist positions that he took and why he was right, and corrects a lot of the bad propaganda that you've talked about. And
then pay me for it.
And then I'd say actually I'm going to give you a couple of mine. I think you should take this last one, which is Marx, Capital, and the Madness of Economic Reason. But then I would precede it by reading The Brief History of Neoliberalism, which is about the history of capital accumulation from the 1970s onwards. But it got up to about 2005, so it was before the crisis. Whereas the new book has a final chapter which updates the neoliberalism book and what's happened to neoliberalism since 2005. So I would say, you would get into things that way. So
expedition of learning. I'm going to start with yours, Professor. Thank you so much for coming on here.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Have I? Did you say I've been great or it's been great?
Yes, you've been great.
All right, brilliant. Thanks.
Yeah,
thanks.
Right.
Hey, why don't we go out on you reading this monologue from Shakespeare that you've concluded? That's right, out of King John. How come you saw King John?
I saw King John because a friend of mine took me there to listen to it, and it's not a great play, but on the other hand, there's this great speech in the middle of it. It goes like this. Mad world, mad kings, mad composition. That smooth-faced gentleman, tickling commodity. Commodity, the bias of the world who of itself is paised well, made to run even upon even ground, till this advantage, this vile drawing bias, this sway of motion, this commodity, makes it take heed from all indifferency, from all direction, purpose, course, intent. And this same bias, this commodity, this board, this broker, this all-changing word. And why rail I on this commodity? But for because he hath not wooed me yet, not that I have the power to clutch my hand when his fair angels would salute my palm, but for my hand is unattempted yet, like a poor beggar raileth on the rich. Well, whilst I'm a beggar, I will rail, and say here is no sin but to be rich. And being rich my virtue then shall be, to say there is no vice but beggary. Since kings break faith upon commodity, gain be my lord, for I will worship thee.
Yes!
It's a great quote. And of course, the first line of Marx's Capital is...
Don't look to me for that. You're the bloody
you're
professor.
Supposed to know it now. You're supposed to know it. You're supposed to know it. The first line is that the wealth of the world in which we're looking at here appears in a great accumulation of commodities.
All right. Shakespeare, Karl Marx, Professor David Harvey, thank you very much for joining us on Under the Skin. It's been a great component and a wonderful education. Thank you.
For me too. Thank you.
All right, cheers. Thanks, mate.